Have you ever wondered what love would look like if it were born from pain, betrayal, and a contract? She was sold like an object. No choice, no voice, no love. At 25, Sophie Adams was handed over by her own family to the most feared billionaire in America, Dominic Hartwell. A man not seeking a wife but revenge. A man whose heart had been shattered by a tragedy, and who chose her to carry the weight of his sorrow. But what he never expected was that the woman he bought would be the only one strong enough to break through the walls he had built his entire life. What starts as punishment slowly transforms into something neither of them can control, until hatred fades, silence cracks, and a forbidden connection demands to be heard. Can love truly rise from the ashes of vengeance, or are some hearts too broken to ever beat again? If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and tell us in the comments, where are you listening from? Your like helps this channel grow and keeps these powerful stories coming. Share this video with someone special. Sophie Adams never imagined that silence could be so deafening. She sat at the edge of the cold leather chair in her father's office, staring blankly at the mahogany desk between them. Her fingers dug into the seams of her dress, knuckles white, breath shallow. She had chosen navy blue, the color of dignity, her mother used to say. But today there was no dignity left to salvage. Across from her, her parents avoided her gaze. Her mother twisted a gold bracelet nervously. Her father stared at the floor, his jaw clenched tight like he was trying not to shatter from the inside out. The contract lay on the desk like a coffin lid. Sophie's name was printed at the bottom. Already signed. Not by her. She had no say. "You're doing this to save us," her mother whispered, almost apologetically, as if the softness of her voice could soften the horror of the truth. "To save everything we've built." Sophie looked at her, the betrayal sharp and fresh in her chest. "You didn't build it. You gambled it away." Her father's eyes flickered, but he said nothing. It wasn't a marriage. It wasn't even an arrangement. It was a transaction, and she was the product. At 25, Sophie Adams was being handed over like an object. No love, no affection, no choice. Her life, her freedom, her body, everything about her was now legally bound to the most feared man in America, Dominic Hartwell. The name alone was enough to make seasoned businessmen fall silent. Ruthless, cold, untouchable. He built his empire from ashes, his own and those of everyone who dared cross him. Why her? Sophie knew. Deep down, she knew it wasn't random. The Hartwells had once been allies with her family, until a tragedy destroyed everything. A tragedy that had left Dominic's fiancée dead, and the Adams name forever tainted. This wasn't about love. It wasn't even about business. It was revenge. And she was the chosen punishment. The ink was dry. The decision made. Her mother handed her a small envelope, plane tickets, instructions, and a letter from Dominic's lawyer. There was no ceremony, no wedding, no vows, only a deadline. "You leave in the morning," her father murmured. Sophie stood, the chair scraping against the floor. Her legs trembled but held. "I'll go," she said, "but don't ask me to smile." The private jet, waiting for her on the runway, looked more like a threat than a luxury. Sophie boarded in silence, escorted by a man in a dark suit who never spoke a word. His eyes were unreadable, trained to ignore pain, or maybe just used to it. She didn't cry. Not during the flight, not when they landed. Not even when she saw the black SUV waiting to take her into the mountains, into Dominic Hartwell's world. The ride was long, winding through thick forests and cliffs that felt like they were closing in. The further they went, the more the air changed, heavy, isolated, dangerous. The gates of his estate loomed like the entrance to another realm, cold, grand, and utterly lifeless. Beyond them, the mansion rose from the earth like a monument to control, glass, stone, and silence. Not a flower in sight, not a bird in the trees. The car stopped. Sophie stepped out, her heels clicking against the flawless stone driveway. She didn't know what to expect. Her staff of people, cameras, an assistant. Instead, the door opened to reveal a single woman, mid-50s, grey hair in a tight bun, expression void of emotion. "I'm Margaret," she said. "You'll be staying in the East Wing." "Not welcome." Not Mrs. Hartwell, not even Miss Adams, just a directive. Margaret led her through endless halls, white walls, black frames, silver light fixtures. No warmth, no personality. Every inch of the place was pristine, sterile, lifeless. Her room was already arranged. Closets full of clothes in her size, shoes lined up with mathematical precision, toiletries labeled with her initials. She hadn't even met him yet. Sophie stood in the middle of the room, arms crossed over her chest, trying not to shake. The message was clear. You belong to him now. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat at the window, watching the wind bend the trees outside. Somewhere in this enormous house, he was here, breathing the same air, watching, maybe. The thought made her skin prickle. When dawn broke, the silence shattered. A knock, firm, deliberate. Before she could answer, the door opened. He walked in like the room belonged to him, because it did. Dominic Hartwell, tall, sharp-featured, dressed in black from head to toe. His eyes were a piercing grey, colder than the frost on the windows. He looked at her like one assesses a sculpture, checking for cracks, flaws, resistance. "Miss Adams," he said, voice smooth and lethal. Sophie rose, keeping her chin high. "Mr. Hartwell." He said nothing for a moment, just watched her. "I see they gave you the blue dress." She didn't answer. He stepped closer, not enough to touch, but enough for her to feel the weight of his presence. "You understand the terms?" "I understand I was sold," she replied evenly. His jaw tensed. "Just for a second. You were chosen." She laughed, bitter, like one picks a punishment. Dominic tilted his head slightly. "You're not what I expected." Sophie's eyes narrowed. "Neither are you." He studied her, not like a man studies a woman he desires, but like a general studies an enemy. And yet, something flickered in his eyes, something unspoken. "Dinner is at 7, he said finally, turning to leave. She stood still. "I won't wear your expectations." He stopped at the doorway, glanced back. "Wear whatever makes you feel powerful, Sophie. It won't matter." Then he was gone. She exhaled only when the door closed behind him. So this was her new life, her new cage. But if he thought she'd crumble, he didn't know her at all. She wasn't here to be obedient. She wasn't here to be broken. If Dominic Hartwell thought he'd bought a doll, he was in for a surprise, because Sophie Adams was still breathing. And she'd learned that silence, when chosen, could be power. The mansion stood like a monument to solitude, nestled high in the California mountains, surrounded by nothing but pine trees, cliffs, and silence. It was a place where the wind whispered secrets no one dared repeat. From the outside, it looked like a palace, imposing, elegant, untouched. But inside, it felt more like a mausoleum. Sophie stood at the top of the grand staircase, her hand resting lightly on the polished marble rail. The air inside was cold, though not from lack of heat. It was the kind of cold that came from absence of life, of laughter, of memory. It seeped into her skin, into her breath, like the house itself wanted to erase her existence. She descended slowly, heels echoing through the empty halls. Everything was immaculate, too immaculate. Not a speck of dust, not a crooked frame, not a single sign that someone actually lived here. The walls were lined with monochrome art, abstract, lifeless shapes in black, grey, and white. Even the furniture seemed designed not for comfort, but for show. Glass, steel, granite. Beauty without warmth. A prison disguised as opulence. She walked past a vast sitting room where no one ever sat, a library with untouched books, a dining hall with 20 chairs but no conversation. The silence wasn't just heard, it was felt, pressing against her chest like invisible hands. Dominic Hartwell had built this fortress not to be admired, but to be alone. Margaret, the housekeeper, moved like a shadow, always appearing just when needed, never speaking more than necessary. She guided Sophie through her schedule without warmth or hostility, just duty. Breakfast is served in the East dining room at 8 sharp. Lunch is optional. Dinner is expected, she recited, as if reading from a manual. You may use the indoor pool, the gym, the garden, or the library. The West Wing is off limits. Sophie raised a brow. What's in the West Wing? Margaret didn't flinch. Memories. Then she walked away. Sophie spent her first full day exploring the estate, as much to learn her new surroundings as to keep herself from losing her mind. She moved through grand halls that echoed with nothing but her footsteps. Every room looked like it had been designed for a catalogue, not a life. There were no family photos, no personal items, no signs of laughter or children or history, just space and silence. She paused at a wide-arched window in the gallery. Outside, the mountain fog clung to the trees, wrapping everything in grey. The view was breathtaking but distant, like everything in this place. Even nature looked untouchable here. Her phone had been taken upon arrival. There was no signal this high up anyway. No internet, no distractions. Just her and the echo of her own thoughts. It was almost enough to make her scream. At lunch, she sat alone in a room with 12 chairs and 3 chandeliers. A single place was set for her. Silver cutlery, crystal glassware, a white napkin folded with military precision. The food was exquisite, plated like art. But she could barely swallow. Margaret didn't join her. No one did. Sophie stabbed a piece of asparagus and stared at the empty seat across from her. "This is what being a luxury object feels like," she muttered to herself. "Beautiful surroundings, perfect meals, and absolute isolation." By the third day, the loneliness had transformed into something sharper, restlessness. She was a caged bird, wings clipped by paper and pen. Every room she entered felt like it was watching her, waiting to see when she'd finally break. And yet, she refused to. Sophie began walking the house with more confidence. Not because she felt at home, but because she refused to feel small. If Dominic thought she'd disappear quietly into the fabric of his walls, he was wrong. She wore her own clothes, not the ones he had provided. She rearranged the vases, moved the books around, opened windows. Small acts of rebellion in a kingdom of control. That evening, just before dinner, she wandered into the music room. A grand piano stood in the center, glossy and untouched, dustless like everything else. She sat on the bench, ran her fingers across the keys, but didn't press down. The silence in the room begged her not to disturb it, and yet she played. A simple melody. Nothing special. Just notes she remembered from childhood, soft, hesitant like she was whispering to the house. The sound echoed off the marble. For a moment, it felt like the mansion exhaled, but then, from the doorway, a voice cut through the air. "I didn't peg you for a pianist." She turned sharply. Dominic stood there, dressed in black again, as if the color had become part of his skin. He leaned against the frame, arms crossed, gaze unreadable. Sophie held his stare. "I wasn't trying to impress you." He stepped in, slow and deliberate. Good, it wouldn't have worked. She stood, pushing the bench back with a scrape. "Then why are you here? I thought you preferred to haunt the halls from a distance." His lips curved slightly. Whether in amusement or annoyance, she couldn't tell. "It's still my house." "No," she corrected, walking past him with deliberate calm. "It's your prison." His smile disappeared. But he didn't stop her as she left the room. Dinner that night was a performance. Margaret served them both in the smaller dining room, a long mahogany table with flickering candlelight. Sophie wore black, not out of mourning, but as armor. Her eyes met Dominic's across the table like a chess player reading her opponent. They ate in silence for a while. Then he finally spoke. "You're not what I expected." She sipped her wine. "Because I don't cower? Or because I'm still here?" "Because you fight," he said. "Most people don't." "Maybe most people haven't been sold like furniture," she replied. He didn't blink. "You had a choice." Sophie's jaw tightened. "You call that a choice? My family threatened with ruin, with prison, with public disgrace. And you, offering salvation wrapped in a chain." "I offered survival." "No," she said, voice quiet but fierce. "You offered submission. I chose dignity." The silence that followed was heavy, thick with things neither of them could say out loud. When the meal ended, he stood first. "You can change the paintings in your room if you'd like," he said, almost as an afterthought. She looked up at him, surprised. "Why?" His eyes met hers for a brief moment. Too brief. Because I want to see what you choose." Then he left her there, in the cold glow of the candles, in the mansion that watched everything but felt nothing. Later that night, Sophie stood in front of one of the paintings in her room. A cold, abstract thing. Just grey and white brushstrokes that looked like frost trapped in glass. She took it down. The wall behind it was blank. But for the first time, it felt like a canvas. It happened on a Thursday afternoon. The air was still, the sky overcast with a thick veil of mountain fog, casting an eerie light through the tall windows of Sophie's room. She had just stepped out of the shower, a towel wrapped around her hair, when the door swung open without a knock. Dominic Hartwell walked in like a storm. Tall, composed, wrapped in black as always, as if morning had become his second skin. His face was unreadable. No anger, no greeting, no warmth, just presence. Dense, commanding, inescapable. Sophie stiffened, her heart leaping into her throat. "Ever heard of knocking?" she snapped, instinctively clutching the robe tighter around her. He didn't blink. "This is my house." "No," she shot back, voice tight. "This is my room." Dominic's gaze swept over her once. Not lewdly, but with a kind of clinical detachment that somehow made her feel even more exposed. She hated the way her skin tingled under his scrutiny, part violation, part something else she wasn't ready to name. "I needed to see you," he said. Sophie narrowed her eyes, then wait in the hallway like a civilized man. For a second, something flickered in his expression. Annoyance? Amusement. It vanished too quickly to read. Instead, he stepped further inside, as if testing how far he could push before she broke. She didn't step back. He looked around the room, noticing the missing painting from the wall. "You took it down." "I didn't like the way it made me feel," she replied. "And how is that?" "Frozen. Trapped. Watched." He tilted his head slightly, as if studying her again. "Fitting. For this house, or for me? For what brought you here?" Sophie's breath hitched, but she didn't let him see the wound behind her eyes. "So this is how you do it? Remind me with every word that I'm not a guest, not a wife. Just your revenge?" Dominic's jaw tensed, but his voice remained even. "You were never meant to be my wife." She already knew that. Still, hearing it said out loud felt like being slapped. "Then what am I, Dominic?" He didn't answer. Instead, his eyes locked onto hers, grey and impenetrable. "Dinner. Tonight. Don't be late." He turned to leave, but Sophie wasn't finished. "Wait." He paused at the door. She stepped forward, arms crossed, robe tied tightly. "Let's get one thing clear. You may have bought silence from my family, but you didn't buy me." He turned his head slightly, just enough for her to catch the edge of his profile. "Didn't I?" Then he was gone, leaving the door wide open behind him. The encounter haunted her for the rest of the day. Not because he'd seen her half-dressed, not because he'd walked in like he owned every breath she took, but because there had been something in his eyes, some flash of emotion, of something broken just for a moment. And it scared her how much she wanted to understand it. At exactly 7 o'clock, she walked into the dining room. She had chosen a modest dress, simple, pale lavender, not provocative, not submissive, just enough to say, "I don't need your approval." Dominic was already seated at the end of the long table, a glass of red wine in his hand. He looked up when she entered but didn't stand. "Right on time," he said. She took the seat opposite him. "Because I follow my own rules." A faint smile touched his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That'll be your undoing, or my salvation." Their eyes met like two swords drawn. Dinner was served in silence. A roasted chicken, seasoned vegetables, wine, perfectly prepared, perfectly lifeless, like everything else in his world. Halfway through the meal, she finally broke the silence. "Why did you pick me?" His knife paused mid-slice. "I mean, specifically," she continued, "there are hundreds of ways you could have humiliated my family, lawsuits, scandals, even prison. But you chose this. You chose me." Dominic set down his fork. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was low, tight. "Because you were untouched by their corruption." Sophie froze. The words felt too sharp, too intimate. "And that made me—" "What?" The perfect punishment. You were the only one who didn't deserve it, he said flatly. And that made it hurt more. She stared at him, stomach twisting. You punished me because it hurt you. He didn't answer. The silence between them was no longer empty. It pulsed with heat, confusion, and something dangerously close to vulnerability. She pushed her plate away. You're a coward. He blinked, slowly. Excuse me? You're hiding behind grief and calling it justice. You think control will protect you, but all it's done is make you cruel. His expression darkened. Careful, Sophie. Why? Are you going to take away my freedom again? Lock me in another room? Remind me I belong to you? She stood now, voice rising. Well, here I am, in your mansion, in your trap, still not broken, still not begging. He rose slowly, eyes locked on hers. The space between them sparked like a live wire. They stood face to face, neither backing down, and for the first time, something shifted. Not hate, not anger, but something tangled and raw, as if both of them had been holding their breath since the day she arrived, and now, standing this close, they could finally feel the other's pain. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't move, didn't speak. Neither did he. But the silence was no longer empty. It was alive. That night, sleep refused to come. Sophie lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The image of Dominic's face burned into her thoughts. His voice echoed in her mind. You were the only one who didn't deserve it, and that made it hurt more. Was that regret? Was it guilt? Or was it something else entirely? Something even he didn't know how to name? And why, despite everything he had done to her, did she feel like she wasn't the only prisoner in that house? The questions circled her like smoke. And just before sleep finally pulled her under, one thought lingered. What happens when the man who owns your body begins to lose control over his own heart? The days began to blur. Morning after morning, Sophie would wake in her perfectly made bed to the sound of nothing but the rustle of wind through the pines outside her window. The mansion, grand as it was, seemed to grow quieter with each passing hour, like a living creature holding its breath. She moved through it with practiced grace now, wearing silence like a second skin. She spoke little, listened more, and observed everything. The house had rhythms, patterns, and none were random. Breakfast was always served at 8 o'clock sharp in the east dining room. The same arrangement, the same porcelain cup, the same untouched bouquet of white orchids at the center of the table. Dominic never joined her. Lunch was optional, and most days Sophie skipped it. Instead, she walked the gardens. She'd found an old stone bench beneath a weeping cedar and claimed it as her own. It was the only place in the estate that felt remotely human. Sometimes she'd sit there for hours, tracing the veins of fallen leaves with her fingers, grounding herself in the only reality that wasn't scripted. But dinner was different. Dinner was expected. The dining room used for evening meals was smaller than the others, more intimate, though it still echoed like a cathedral. Sophie arrived each night dressed not for him but for herself. One night in emerald green, the next in soft cream, once in sharp navy, just to remind him of the day she had been signed away. Dominic was always there before her, always seated, always still. They rarely spoke, not more than a few words. He would nod, she would sit, Margaret would serve, and the rest was silence. But it was never empty, because the silence between them was growing heavier, thick with what remained unsaid. One evening, as Sophie stirred her soup without eating, she broke the quiet. "Do you always eat with your prisoners?" Dominic didn't look up. "You're not a prisoner." "No? Then what am I?" He set his spoon down gently, then leaned back in his chair, fingers interlocked. "An arrangement." Sophie smiled, but there was no joy in it. "You mean a performance?" "Perhaps," he admitted. She tilted her head. "For whom?" "There's no one here but us." Dominic's eyes met hers. "That's precisely why the performance matters." Their gaze locked for a moment too long, the air between them tightening like a wire pulled taut. Then he returned to his plate without another word. Days passed, and the silence evolved. It was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the silence of two people circling each other in the dark, waiting to see who would light the first match. Sophie began to notice small changes. One night, he asked if she preferred tea or coffee in the mornings. She said coffee. The next morning it was there, rich, dark, exactly the way she liked it. Another time she made an offhand comment about the paintings in the hallway being soulless. The next day, 2 of them were gone. He never mentioned the changes, but they were happening, subtle, intentional, and that terrified her more than his silence ever had, because it meant he was watching, not just her movements, her being, her choices, her tone, her pauses. And somewhere between the meals and the silence, the walls between them had started to crack. One evening she entered the dining room early and found him already seated, staring at a closed book in front of him. She hesitated. "You read?" Dominic didn't look up. "Sometimes." "What is it?" He finally raised his eyes to hers. "A book about grief." Sophie's throat tightened. She sat down slowly. "Is it helping?" "No." "Then why read it?" "Because pain needs somewhere to go," he said simply. "Even if it's into the wrong words." She studied him in the flickering light. For a second, he wasn't the man who'd bought her. He wasn't the tyrant in the castle. He was just broken. And maybe she understood that too well. "Where does your pain go, Sophie?" he asked suddenly. She wasn't ready for the question. No one had asked her that in years. She swallowed. Into silence. A long pause. Dominic nodded, as if her answer was both expected and respected. Then dinner was served. The next few meals changed subtly after that. Still no unnecessary conversation, but there was eye contact. A slight lean forward, an occasional, careful question. "Did you always live in the city?" "Yes." "Downtown?" "It was noisy, but it made me feel alive." "Were you close to your parents?" "Once." He nodded, as if he too once was. Each meal was a duel of glances, of body language, of emotional restraint, and yet a new thread was forming. Fragile, but undeniable. One night she reached for the salt at the same time he did. Their fingers brushed. The contact lasted less than a second, but her heart didn't stop racing for minutes. Still, the line between civility and control remained razor-thin. Sophie tested it. One morning she walked into the breakfast room in nothing but an oversized button-down shirt and bare legs. She made sure it was deliberate. Dominic wasn't there, but she knew he'd hear about it. And when he walked into dinner that evening, his jaw was tighter than usual. She smiled sweetly as she took her seat. He said nothing, but his wine glass cracked slightly under the pressure of his hand. Another time, she rearranged the dining table, moved her seat from the far end to beside him. When he arrived, he stopped for half a second, just enough to reveal surprise, then sat beside her without a word. That night, she could feel the heat of his presence in every breath. When she reached for her water, her fingers trembled slightly. The games escalated. So did the stakes. She wore colors she knew would make him look twice, spoke with softness that disguised sharpness, smiled when he least expected it. And Dominic, he allowed it. Not encouraged, not praised, but allowed. That was his tell. That was his crack. And Sophie, who had entered the house as a victim, was no longer playing defense. She was studying him, noticing the way his hand sometimes lingered over the tablecloth, as if debating whether to reach out, the way his voice dropped an octave when he spoke her name, the way he looked at her when she wasn't looking, and in that tension, something began to change, not loudly, not obviously, but deeply. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner, Dominic stood and walked toward the fireplace. He didn't look at her. "Do you know why I never talk during meals?" She looked up, startled by the sudden question. "No." "Because when I do," he said quietly, "I remember what it was like to talk to someone I loved." Silence. He turned slowly, his eyes meeting hers. "You're not her, Sophie, I know that, but sometimes, when I'm not careful..." He didn't finish. He didn't have to. Because she understood the weight of memories that sneak into new places. The ghosts that follow us into new conversations, new eyes, new rooms. She rose slowly, stood across from him, not touching, not comforting, just witnessing. "That's not love," she said gently. "That's a wound trying to bleed again." He didn't reply, but for the first time he didn't retreat. And as Sophie lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling as she often did, her thoughts were no longer about escape. They were about the strange quiet that lived between them. The kind that didn't hurt anymore, but whispered instead, "He sees you." The summer sun returned unexpectedly. After days cloaked in fog and chill, light spilled through the tall windows of the mansion, draping the marble floors in warmth Sophie hadn't felt in weeks. Outside, the gardens shimmered in gold, and the stillness of the estate felt, just for a moment, less like a tomb. She stood before her mirror, the closet doors behind her wide open. Her eyes scanned the rows of carefully curated dresses Dominic's people had selected, elegant, modest, formal, predictable. She ignored them all. Instead, she reached for the box in the back, the one she'd carried in silence through airports and gates. The one filled not with things she was given, but the things she chose. From it, she pulled out a sleek black swimsuit, nothing vulgar, but bold, confident. It hugged her body like it belonged there. She pulled her hair into a loose bun, slipped into a light cover-up, and walked out of the room without hesitation. Today she wouldn't disappear into the corners of Dominic Hartwell's world. Today she would walk through it like she owned it. The pool was carved into the edge of the estate's western cliff, an architectural wonder of blue water against stone, surrounded by columns and shaded lounges. It had the feel of a Roman bathhouse, elegant and stark. Sophie stepped barefoot onto the sun-warmed stone, dropped the cover-up without ceremony, and walked straight into the water. Cool, inviting, liberating. She didn't swim. Not really. She glided, let herself float, let her body reclaim space in a world that had tried to shrink her. She didn't hear his footsteps until she felt his presence, heavy, charged, magnetic. When she looked up, Dominic stood at the edge of the pool, dressed in a crisp white shirt and dark slacks, sleeves rolled up just enough to suggest a man at war with relaxation. His eyes moved over her body like lightning, not vulgar, but consuming. The stillness in his posture betrayed the chaos beneath it. "You're trespassing," he said quietly. She floated closer to the edge, meeting his gaze without flinching. "On my own punishment?" He stepped forward, shoes close to the water's edge. "I think this is a game." "No," she replied, "but you do. You just never expected your pawn to know how to play." His jaw tightened. "Cover yourself." She smiled slowly. "Why? Am I distracting you?" A silence followed, tense, crackling, hot. Dominic didn't answer. His eyes said too much already. She swam to the edge, lifted herself out of the water in one graceful movement, and reached for the towel slowly, deliberately. Water slid down her body like silk. He turned away before she could read his expression. Victory or warning? That night at dinner, the tension could have shattered the chandelier above them. Sophie arrived in a deep burgundy dress, the neckline soft but daring. Her hair fell in waves. Her perfume, delicate like rose and fire, reached him before she even sat down. Dominic's gaze was sharp, guarded. They said nothing for the first few courses. Then she spoke, voice smooth. "You wanted a wife you could punish. You never said anything about her being quiet." "I didn't ask for commentary," he replied. She tilted her head. "Then why do you keep responding?" He set his fork down carefully. "Because I'm still deciding whether I admire your defiance or resent it." She leaned forward. "Maybe it's both." Their eyes clashed again. War and surrender, lust and loathing. She could feel it now, the unspoken tug between them. Not just power, but awareness. The way his eyes flicked to her lips when she spoke. The way his voice always lowered when she challenged him. The way she could feel the heat of his stare even when her back was turned. And he felt her presence like a flame he could neither touch nor extinguish. The next day, she found a piano in the West Wing. She wasn't supposed to be there, but doors were made to be opened and so were wounds. She sat down, let her fingers find a melody that had no name. Slow, aching, rich with longing. She didn't hear him enter, didn't have to. She felt it. His voice came from behind her, quiet. That was her favorite room. Sophie stopped playing, hands frozen on the keys. "Natalie." He didn't answer, just stepped forward, slowly, until he stood beside her. His eyes lingered on the keys. She used to play, not well, but passionately. Sophie turned to him, the air thick with memory. "Is that why it's off limits? Because it still remembers her? She's everywhere in this house," he said. "But this room is where she was most alive." Sophie watched his face, saw the pain behind the control, the man behind the myth. "You can't punish the past by imprisoning the present," she said gently. His eyes flicked to hers. "I'm not punishing you." "No," she whispered. "You're punishing yourself." He stepped back. "You shouldn't be here." "But I am." "And what do you want, Sophie?" She stood now, inches from him. "I want you to admit that you lost control the day I arrived, that you created this prison not for me, but to protect yourself from what you feel when I walk into a room." The words hung in the air between them, sharp and devastating. He stared at her, unmoving. Then, slowly, he turned and walked away, without a word. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat at her window, watching the stars pulse above the black trees. She'd crossed a line. She could feel it, not in anger, but in something far more dangerous. Emotion. Dominic Hartwell wasn't just unraveling. He was beginning to feel. And the question that echoed louder than any silence was, what happens when the man who bought your body starts fearing the power of your soul? The rain came suddenly. One moment, the California skies were clear and silent. The next, thunder rolled through the mountains like a growl, and thick drops slammed against the windows of the mansion, blurring the world outside. Sophie stood in the hallway, staring at the storm. Something in her chest mirrored the sky, tight, volatile, waiting to break. She wondered. The silence in the house felt different now, not empty, but charged. Ever since the moment in the piano room, Dominic had been absent. Not physically. He still appeared at meals, still walked the halls, but emotionally he was retreating, and she felt it. He was hiding something, something deeper than power, something darker than grief, and that something had to do with her. That evening, as the storm raged, she heard the voice, not Dominic's, not Margaret's, but his, through a crack in a door she'd never seen open before. His office. She'd been warned to stay away from that part of the house, but tonight the door was ajar, and Dominic was inside speaking into a phone, low, tight, unaware she was there. Sophie moved closer, holding her breath. "Her name is Sophie Adams," he said. A pause. "I don't care what the press says. She's not a victim. She's the consequence." Sophie's heart slammed against her ribs. Another pause. Then, "Her father's employee caused the crash. Natalie died because of them. I gave them a choice, and now I'm living with mine." Sophie stepped back, as if the words had burned her skin. The puzzle pieces fell into place all at once, sharp, cruel, inevitable. This wasn't about business, or saving her family, or even power. This was about Natalie, the fiancé he'd lost, the love buried beneath grief and rage. Sophie wasn't just a symbol, she was retribution. She didn't wait for him to finish the call. She burst into the office, her voice shaking. "So, that's what I am." Dominic's head snapped up, eyes wide with surprise. "Sophie, don't," she snapped, trembling. "Don't say my name like I matter." He rose slowly, as if trying to control the unraveling, but it was too late. "You bought me to punish them," she said. "But I'm not them. I didn't kill anyone." "I never said you did," he replied. "But you knew," she said, voice breaking. "You knew I was innocent and you chose me anyway. Why?" His jaw tensed. "Because innocence makes the punishment cleaner." She flinched, as if struck. "You're a monster," she whispered. "No," he said quietly. "I'm a man who lost everything." "That doesn't give you the right to destroy someone else," she said, "especially someone who had nothing to do with it." Dominic stepped forward slowly. "You were the only thing they still loved. Their shining daughter, their image. I wanted them to suffer, and I knew they would if it meant losing you." Sophie stared at him, shaking her head. You didn't want a wife, you wanted a weapon. He didn't deny it, and that was the worst part. She left the room in silence, the storm following her like a shadow. Her steps were fast, her breath uneven. She needed air, space. A way to escape the truth, now lodged in her ribs like broken glass. She ran through the halls, past the gallery, past the piano room, toward the garden. The rain poured over her as she stepped outside barefoot, her dress clinging to her skin. Thunder cracked above, but she didn't flinch. She stood there, face tilted to the sky, and let the water wash over her like it could cleanse her from what he had done, what he had made of her. She wasn't the girl who had arrived weeks ago. She was someone else now. Someone who had looked love in the eye and seen the blade behind it. She didn't return that night. Not to her room. Not to the dinner table. Not to the silence they'd learned to share. Instead, she sat in the stone pavilion at the far edge of the estate, soaked and shaking, until the storm passed and the stars emerged like hesitant witnesses. When she finally returned inside, the house was still, but her door was open, and he was there. Dominic stood at the window, arms crossed, his shirt damp from rain. He didn't turn when she entered. "I looked for you," he said. She said nothing. "You're right," he continued. "Everything you said in the office, you're right." She closed the door behind her. Dominic turned then, his face more tired than she had ever seen it. "I thought I could live with it," he said. "With using you, with burying what I felt every time you walked into a room. But I can't." "You used my body to bury your grief," she said coldly. "No," he said. "I used your presence to punish their absence. And I regret it more than I've ever regretted anything in my life." Sophie looked at him, her voice a whisper now. "So what now?" He stepped closer, carefully. "Now, I let you decide." "For once?" He nodded. For always. She wanted to hate him, to scream, to run, to make him feel what she had felt. Betrayed, discarded, used. But the truth was more complicated, because even through the lies, the manipulation, the pain, there had been moments of truth. A hand brushing hers too long. A breath caught in silence. A stare that lasted too long to be empty. Dominic Hartwell had hurt her, but he had also begun to change, and that, more than anything, terrified her, because change meant hope, and hope meant risk, and she wasn't sure she had the strength to lose again. She looked at him one last time. His eyes were no longer sharp. They were raw. "I need to be alone," she said. He nodded. Then he left her there, finally understanding that the only way to hold her was to let her go. The mountain air was crisp that morning, laced with the scent of pine and the chill of something unsettled. The mansion still slept, blanketed in silence. But Sophie was already dressed, boots laced tightly, a canvas bag slung over her shoulder. She moved like a ghost through the halls, unseen, unheard. She had studied the estate in silence for weeks, learned its rhythms, the paths of the staff, the timing of the gates. She knew the trail that disappeared behind the north gardens, the one hidden beneath the arch of overgrown ivy. It was steep, winding and long, but it led down the cliffs, past the cameras, and eventually to a service road. That was her plan, not to disappear forever, just to breathe, to choose herself, if only once. She made it as far as the edge of the trail before she heard him. "Sophie!" Her body froze, heart slamming in her chest. She turned slowly. Dominic stood a few paces behind her. No coat, no guards, no anger, just him. His hair slightly tousled, his shirt wrinkled from rushed movement. He looked like a man who had run until his lungs burned. "How did you—" "I saw your boots missing," he said, "and you weren't at breakfast." She swallowed, gripping the strap of her bag tighter. "I'm not running from you." "I know," he said. "You're running to yourself." His voice held no judgment, only something deeper, understanding, that shook her more than if he'd yelled. "Let me go," she said quietly. "I will," he replied, "but not like this." She hesitated. "You said I could choose," she reminded him. "And you can," Dominic said, stepping closer. "But not while you're carrying anger that isn't yours." She frowned. "What are you talking about?" "I never told you the truth," he said. "Not all of it. She didn't speak. She couldn't. Dominic sat on the low stone wall that bordered the edge of the path, his eyes scanning the forest below. Then he began. "The day Natalie died," he said. "She wasn't supposed to be in that car. We had argued about something stupid. I don't even remember what. She left early, wanted space." Sophie stood still, listening. "The accident was caused by an employee of your father's company," he continued. "Drunk, reckless, driving a delivery truck without proper rest. They covered it up, bribed witnesses, paid off the press." Sophie closed her eyes. She remembered hearing whispers, lawsuits that vanished, a quiet resignation. But she had been too young, too sheltered to understand. "I tried to sue," Dominic said. "But your family had leverage, money, protection. They buried the truth." She opened her eyes. "So you buried me instead?" "No," he said softly. "I tried to walk away. I moved to Europe for a year. I stopped speaking to everyone. But everywhere I went, I saw her. And every time I thought of her, I saw you." Her brow furrowed. "Why me?" "Because you were innocent. Because you looked at me like she used to before the world taught her to be careful." He stood now, facing her fully. "You reminded me that I was still capable of feeling, and I hated you for it." Tears pricked the back of Sophie's eyes. "I told myself if I brought you here, if I controlled the one piece of their world they still cared about, I could make the pain go away." He stepped closer, slowly. "But instead," he said, voice cracking, "you made me remember what it's like to be alive." She looked away, wiping at her face with the back of her hand. "That's not fair." "I know. You can't just break me and then say you're sorry. I'm not asking for forgiveness," he said. "I'm asking you to see me. The way I finally see you." She shook her head, tears falling now. "You don't get to see me now," she whispered. "Not after everything." Dominic stepped forward again, so close she could feel the heat of him. "I know I don't deserve it," he said, "but I need you to hear one thing." She didn't move. He reached for her hand, hesitant, trembling, and placed it over his chest. His heart thudded beneath her palm. "When I realized you weren't just someone I used," he whispered, "I broke." Sophie felt his heartbeat, fast, vulnerable, real. "I didn't just want you gone anymore," he continued. "I wanted you free. But I couldn't stand the thought of never seeing you again." She pulled her hand back gently, and for a moment they just stood there, two people in the middle of a forest, holding more pain than words could carry. Then she whispered, "I wasn't supposed to fall for you." His breath hitched. "Did you?" She met his eyes. "I don't know." He nodded. That was enough. She didn't continue down the trail. Instead, she walked back toward the house, slowly, quietly. Dominic didn't follow. He stayed there alone, watching her walk away, not as a possession, not as a punishment, but as the one thing he had never expected to see again. Hope. That evening, she sat in the garden under the weeping cedar. Rain clung to the leaves above, dripping gently onto the grass. She closed her eyes. She didn't know what would happen next. She only knew that something had shifted, not just in him, but in her. Because for the first time, the mansion didn't feel like a prison. It felt like a question, one only her heart could answer. The days that followed unfolded in quiet, uncertain rhythms. Sophie didn't speak to Dominic, not directly, but something had changed between them, like the air in the mansion had softened. The weight was still there, but the sharp edges had dulled. The war had quieted, replaced by something tentative, something watching and waiting. Each morning, her coffee was still prepared exactly the way she liked it. Each evening, Dominic sat across from her at dinner, saying little but listening with his whole body. There were no apologies, no declarations, no promises. But there was presence. And for two people who had spent their lives building walls, that alone felt like an act of courage. It was on a Thursday, nearly a month since she had first arrived, when everything shifted. The storm hit just after nightfall, sudden and wild, lightning dancing across the mountains like fire. Sophie sat curled on the window seat in her room, book in her lap, reading the same paragraph over and over. She couldn't concentrate, because something felt off. Not bad, just charged, like the world was holding its breath. A loud crack of thunder startled her, and the lights flickered. Then the power cut entirely. The house plunged into darkness. For a moment the silence was absolute. Then footsteps. Heavy, purposeful. A knock on her door. Sophie. It was him. She opened the door to find Dominic standing there, a flashlight in one hand, the faintest trace of uncertainty in his voice. Margaret said the generator's acting up. Most of the staff went to check the lower level. And you came to... His eyes met hers. I didn't want you to be alone in the dark. She could have laughed. The irony was too rich. I've been in the dark since the day I got here, she said softly. He didn't smile. He didn't argue. He simply said, then let me stay. Just for tonight. They sat together in the candlelit library. She curled into the arm of the velvet sofa, barefoot, her knees pulled up, a blanket draped over her lap. Dominic sat opposite, his jacket off, shirt sleeves rolled up, hands resting on his knees. Outside the rain poured like confession. Inside the silence between them was no longer cold. It was warm, slow, like a lullaby with no words. You once asked where my pain goes, Sophie said quietly. He looked up. I never answered properly, she continued, but the truth is it went into everything. The way I smiled when I didn't want to, the way I forgave people who didn't ask for it, the way I stopped trusting what I felt. He leaned forward slightly, listening like it mattered more than anything else in the world. I've been trying to survive my whole life, she said. Not live, just survive. Dominic's voice was low. And now? She met his eyes. Now I want to feel something real, even if it hurts. Later, as the fire in the hearth crackled low and the storm continued outside, she stood, walked to the window. Her silhouette was soft in the glow of the flames, and Dominic watched her like someone seeing something holy. She turned slowly to him. Why haven't you touched me? His breath caught. You had every right, she added, not bitterly, but curiously. By the contract, I mean. By the power you built for yourself. Dominic rose, moving closer, but keeping a careful distance. Because I didn't want your body, he said. I wanted your spirit, and now that I see it, I don't want to break it. Her heart clenched. You already did, she whispered. He closed his eyes briefly. Then let me rebuild it. They stood in silence, breath mingling in the space between them, and then she stepped forward. Not out of obligation, but choice. She reached up, her fingers brushing the side of his face. He didn't move, didn't flinch. He just looked at her like she was the beginning of something he'd never believed he deserved. Their lips met softly, tentative, unsure. Then again, deeper this time. It wasn't passion, not yet. It was surrender. Later, he carried her to his room, not like a possession, but like something fragile. They didn't rush. They didn't strip away pain with hunger. They peeled away fear with gentleness, touch by touch, breath by breath. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And when they lay wrapped in each other afterward, tangled in sheets and silence, Sophie rested her head against his chest and whispered, What happens now? Dominic didn't answer at first. Then, softly, he said, Now, we begin. But life, like love, doesn't shift without testing what's real. The next morning, as sunlight poured through the windows, Sophie stood on the balcony of his room, barefoot and glowing. She looked out at the estate, at the trees and stones and shadows that had once trapped her. Now they simply stood still, waiting. Inside, Dominic made coffee. When he handed her the mug, she noticed the way his hand trembled just slightly. And for the first time she saw it. The man who had once been so sure, now afraid of the very thing he'd longed for. Connection, hope, her. Sophie leaned into him, pressed a kiss to his chest. He wrapped his arms around her, tighter than ever before. And in that stillness he whispered, Don't disappear. She looked up. I'm not going anywhere. But neither of them said the words they both feared most. What if love isn't enough to erase what we did to get here? Morning came dressed in gold, but Dominic Hartwell had already returned to the shadows. Sophie woke alone. The side of the bed where he had slept was cold. There was no note, no message, no trace of his presence except the memory of how he had held her. like she was both his anchor and his undoing. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, staring at the floor. Something inside her had shifted last night, not just her body, not just her trust, her heart. And now he was gone. Hours passed. He didn't come to breakfast, didn't walk through the halls, didn't meet her for their usual silent dinner. When she finally found him, he was in the study, standing by the tall windows, speaking sharply into his phone. "No," he said, voice clipped. "Tell the board the deal won't be delayed. I'll fly to New York next week." A beat. "I don't care what they think. This isn't personal." He ended the call without noticing her. Or maybe he had, and was pretending not to. Sophie leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "So, you're leaving?" He turned slowly, face composed, eyes cold again. "Yes," he said. "Just for a few days, business." "Right. Because nothing personal ever happens here." He ignored the bite in her tone. "You'll be safe here. Margaret knows everything you need." Sophie stepped into the room, heart pounding. "Is this your idea of dealing with what happened?" "What happened," he said flatly, "was a moment." "A moment?" she repeated, stunned. He held her gaze. "One we shouldn't repeat." The air in the room changed, sharp, bitter, electric. Sophie took a step closer. "Don't do that." "Do what?" "Hide," she said. "Behind that voice, that tone, that suit." Dominic's jaw tightened. "I'm not hiding. I'm protecting us both from a mistake." She laughed, quiet but full of pain. "So, that's what I am now? A mistake?" His silence answered for him. Sophie's voice trembled. "You held me like I mattered. You kissed me like you'd forgotten how to breathe. And now you stand there and act like it was nothing." He turned away. She moved to stand in front of him, blocking his exit. "Look at me." "I am," he said. "Then tell me the truth." "I don't love you," Dominic said. Too fast, too flat, too rehearsed. Sophie's breath caught, her hands clenched at her sides. "Liar," she whispered. He stepped around her, reaching for his coat. "I'll be back in 3 days." "No, you won't," she said. "Because I won't be here when you get back." He paused, hand frozen on the doorknob. But he didn't turn, didn't stop her, didn't say a single word. And that silence screamed louder than anything else. That night, Sophie sat alone in the dining room. The candles flickered. The chair across from her stayed empty. And her heart ached in a way it hadn't even when she was sold, because this time she had given herself, and he had walked away. 2 days passed. She packed her things slowly, methodically. She didn't cry. Not until she opened the drawer beside his bed and found the photo. It was of Natalie, smiling, wild and free. Behind it a second photo, of Sophie, taken recently. She didn't even know when. But there it was, tucked behind the woman he had lost, like a secret he wasn't ready to admit. She sat on the bed, holding the 2 images, one in each hand. Then gently, she placed them side by side. On the 3rd night, the estate buzzed with whispers. Dominic was back, but he didn't go to the office, didn't ask for Margaret. He went straight to Sophie's room and found it empty. Her bag was gone, the closet half cleared, the air different. He stood there unmoving for what felt like hours. Then his eyes caught the photograph on the pillow. Natalie and Sophie, side by side. And suddenly, Dominic Hartwell, man of power, man of vengeance, man of silence, collapsed into the chair, head in his hands, and let the pain finally come. Not for Natalie, not for revenge, but for the woman who had asked him to fight for her, and whom he'd pushed away out of fear. The house had never felt so quiet, not even in the early days, when Sophie had tiptoed through its halls, afraid of touching too much or breathing too loudly. Now there was only the echo of her absence. Dominic walked from room to room like a man searching for something he couldn't name. Every corner whispered her name. Her laugh haunted the stairwell. Her perfume clung to the sheets, faint and floral, like the last breath of something beautiful. And every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face the moment she said, "Liar," because she had known. Because he hadn't just denied her, he had denied himself. That night he sat by the fire in the West Wing. The forbidden room. Natalie's room. He hadn't entered it in over a year. Now it smelled of dust and time. The furniture remained untouched. Her scarf still hung from the back of the chair, her piano sheet still open to the last song she never finished. He sat at the edge of the chaise lounge, the photo of Sophie still in his hand. His heart thudded with something he had no name for, but it ached like truth. Margaret found him the next morning, eyes hollow from a night without sleep. She said nothing, simply placed a cup of coffee by his hand, then paused. She left for the city, she said quietly. A small apartment on the east side. Didn't ask for money, didn't ask for protection. Dominic didn't look up. She just wanted space, Margaret added, and a chance to feel like herself again. When she turned to go, he finally spoke. "Do you think I'm too late?" Margaret paused in the doorway. "I think love never arrives late, only uninvited." Then she was gone. 3 days passed, then 4. Each morning he picked up the phone. Each night he set it down again. What could he say? What could he offer that wouldn't sound like manipulation or guilt or fear dressed as redemption? He was a man who had everything and still managed to destroy the one thing that had asked for nothing in return. But love doesn't wait forever. And sometimes the only way to win it back is to risk everything. He drove, not in a black SUV or behind tinted glass. He drove himself, through the winding roads that once caged her, into the city that now held her. Past buildings, honking taxis, street musicians playing songs no one listened to. When he found her building, it was modest, quiet, no guards, no marble, just real. He stood outside her door for nearly 10 minutes, then knocked. Nothing. He knocked again, softer. Then the door opened. She stood there in jeans and a faded sweatshirt, barefoot, a cup of tea in her hand. And when her eyes met his, Dominic forgot how to breathe. Sophie didn't speak, didn't step aside, didn't cry. She simply waited. Dominic swallowed hard. "I shouldn't have left." She raised an eyebrow. "But you did." "I was afraid." "Of me?" she asked, voice calm. "Of loving you." A long silence stretched between them. He continued, voice rough. "With Natalie, I loved easily. With you, I loved in pieces, in denial, in silence, in shadows." She looked down at the tea in her hand. "And now?" "Now I can't stop." Sophie's breath caught. Dominic stepped closer, not touching her. "You asked me once why I never touched you at the beginning. It wasn't about control. It was because I knew even then that if I touched you with truth, I'd never be able to let go." She looked up slowly. "And what if I don't trust you anymore?" "Then I'll earn it," he said. "Every day, with every word, with every breath." Another pause. Then Sophie opened the door wider, just an inch. But it was enough. They sat on the floor that evening, not on furniture. Just a blanket, 2 cups of tea, and the city lights outside her window. He told her about the guilt. She told him about the fear. He told her how he used silence as a shield. She told him how she used defiance as armor. And somewhere between the confessions, her head found his shoulder, and his hand found her fingers. And when the city fell asleep around them, Sophie whispered, "I didn't stop loving you, Dominic. I just stopped believing you knew how to love me back." He kissed her hand, then said the words neither of them had dared speak before, "I love you." Not in power, not in possession, but in surrender. The mansion felt different when they returned, not because the walls had changed, or the air had warmed, or the halls had softened, but because they had. Sophie stepped into the grand foyer not as a captive, not as a stranger, not even as a symbol of vengeance, but as a woman who had been chosen and who had chosen back. And Dominic walked beside her, not in silence but in presence. A man once ruled by control, now learning piece by piece how to love with intention. The days that followed were quiet, tender, unhurried. No grand gestures, no forced declarations, just the ordinary made extraordinary by the presence of trust. He joined her for breakfast now, late, unshaven, coffee in hand, asking about her dreams, as if they mattered more than the market's opening in New York. She walked barefoot through the halls now, humming softly, her laughter filling rooms that once only echoed her footsteps. They danced in the kitchen once, music low, flower on her nose, his arms around her waist. And when he kissed her then, it wasn't desperate or fierce, it was home. Dominic began to change the house too, one photo at a time. A picture of Sophie appeared on the mantel. Fresh flowers replaced cold vases. Music played in the background. Jazz, sometimes piano, sometimes silence, made soft by two people simply being. Even the staff felt it. The shift, the warmth, the peace. It was as if grief had finally exhaled. Then came the moment that would change everything. Sophie sat curled on the living room sofa, her hands wrapped around a cup of ginger tea. She hadn't been feeling well all week. Nausea, fatigue, small dizzy spells she tried to ignore. But that day, something inside her felt different, deeper, as if something within her had already begun. She didn't say anything at first, not until later that night, when Dominic found her sitting alone in the garden beneath the stars, eyes wide with something between fear and wonder. He sat beside her, brushing hair from her face. "What is it?" Her voice trembled. "I think I'm pregnant." Silence. The word hung between them like a firefly, delicate, glowing, unbelievable. Dominic stared at her, lips parted slightly. "You're sure?" "I'll take a test tomorrow," she said, "but yes, I feel it." He was quiet for a long time. Then he placed his hand gently over her stomach, his fingers shaking, and when he looked at her, his eyes were full, full of everything he had buried, full of everything he never thought he could feel again. "Sophie," he whispered. But she shook her head. "Don't say anything. Not yet. Just be here. Right here." So he stayed, holding her, holding the future. The next morning the test confirmed what they already knew, and Dominic cried, not loudly, not dramatically, just a single tear that slid down his cheek as he sat beside her on the edge of the bathtub, the tiny test in his hand, his other hand gripping hers like a lifeline. "I don't know how to be a father," he said. "You didn't know how to love me either," she replied softly. "But look how far you came." He kissed her then, slow and deep, like a vow. Over the next few weeks, the transformation became visible, not just in Sophie's changing body, but in Dominic's changing soul. He started taking calls in the garden now, pacing near her bench so he could keep her in view. He read books on fatherhood in the evenings, highlighting passages he didn't always understand but wanted to. He replaced the wine in the cellar with juice she liked, installed a piano in the living room, new, warm-sounding, meant for lullabies. He even painted a room, by hand, a nursery, soft yellow walls, white trim, a window seat facing the sunrise. "I don't know what I'm doing," he confessed one night, standing in the middle of it, paintbrush in hand. Sophie hugged him from behind. "That's how I know you're doing it right." For the first time, the mansion wasn't just filled with light, it was filled with life. Laughter echoed in the halls. Sophie sang to her belly in the mornings. Dominic talked to it at night, whispering secrets and promises and fears. "I'm going to love you right," he said once, his head resting on her lap. "Better than I knew how to love myself." Sophie ran her fingers through his hair. "You already are." One night as they lay in bed, the baby kicked for the first time. Dominic's hand was on her belly. His eyes lit up, and he broke into tears again, more freely this time. "Why are you crying?" she whispered. "Because," he said, voice cracking, "you've given me everything I didn't know how to ask for. The man who once ruled from shadows, the man who bought her as a weapon, the man who lost love and thought he'd buried his heart with it, had finally become something else. Not just a lover, not just a husband, but a father, a partner. A man who had learned how to build a home from the ashes of revenge." And as Sophie stood by the nursery window one morning, sunlight pouring in, her hand resting on her belly, she smiled. Not because the pain was gone, but because it had led her here, to this peace, to this man, to this child, and to the life she had never dared dream of. The night Gabriel was born, the skies above the mountains wept with joy. Rain tapped gently against the mansion's windows, not in fury, but in rhythm. like a lullaby sent from something greater. The world had gone still, as if nature itself was holding its breath, waiting for a new life to arrive. Sophie gripped Dominic's hand tighter than she ever had before, her body trembling with pain, strength, and something sacred. He stayed by her side through every second, sleeves rolled, jaw clenched, whispering her name like a prayer. "You're doing so well," he murmured, forehead pressed to hers. Her response was a cry, raw, guttural, fierce. And then a second cry, tiny, powerful, alive. Gabriel Hartwell entered the world at 2:17 a.m. His fists clenched, his lungs strong, his presence undeniable. And when they placed him on Sophie's chest, the entire universe seemed to collapse and begin again, all in one breath. Dominic didn't speak at first. He simply stared at the small, squirming miracle wrapped in white, at Sophie's tear-streaked face, glowing with exhaustion and triumph. Then his own tears came, quiet and uncontrolled. He reached for his son with trembling hands, held him close, and broke. Not because he was afraid, but because, for the first time in his life, he felt whole. The days after Gabriel's birth were nothing like the days before. The mansion was no longer a fortress, it was a cradle, a sanctuary, a place of beginnings. Sunlight poured through the windows like blessing. Music returned to the halls, soft lullabies, laughter, the occasional squeak of the floorboards as Dominic paced with the baby cradled against his chest. Sophie watched him in those moments, a soft smile always tugging at her lips, because the man who once ruled through silence now hummed under his breath, because the man who once feared love now kissed his son's forehead like it was sacred, because the man who once said, "I don't love you," now said, "I never knew how, until you." They named him Gabriel after Sophie's grandfather, a quiet man who had taught her that gentleness was not weakness, and that true strength was in showing up day after day for the people you love. Dominic insisted on building the crib himself. It took him 3 days, 2 broken drill bits, and 1 very patient tutorial from a YouTube video. When it was finished, Sophie stood beside him, smiling as they laid Gabriel down for his first nap. The baby stirred, tiny fingers curling around Dominic's pinky, and in that moment, the man who had once sought revenge felt redeemed. One afternoon, as spring began to bloom, Sophie found Dominic in the garden. He sat on the bench beneath the weeping cedar, the same bench where she once cried in the rain, unsure if she'd ever be free again. Now she walked toward him slowly, Gabriel asleep in her arms, his breath soft against her skin. Dominic looked up, eyes filled with something that could only be described as wonder. She sat beside him, placed the baby in his arms, and rested her head on his shoulder. The garden around them buzzed with life, flowers opening, bees humming, the world turning quietly forward. He kissed her hair and whispered, "You gave me a son." Sophie smiled. "You gave me a life." Later that week, they walked through the gallery together. Dominic had replaced the cold, abstract paintings with warmth, a framed photo of Gabriel's first yawn, a candid shot of Sophie twirling barefoot in the kitchen, a charcoal sketch he commissioned of the moment she first held their son. At the end of the hallway, a new frame, an inscription beneath it. What began as revenge became redemption. On Gabriel's 1-month night, they sat outside beneath the stars, wrapped in a blanket, the baby asleep in Sophie's arms. Dominic looked at her, not like a man looking at the woman he conquered, but like a man who nearly lost the woman he never knew he needed. "I never imagined," he said quietly, "that a contract could lead me here." Sophie glanced over. "To what?" He smiled. "To love." Then added after a beat, "To home." They sat in silence for a while, watching their son's tiny chest rise and fall, listening to the sounds of life blooming around them. Then Dominic said something she'd never forget. "I would burn every contract, every dollar, every wall I ever built, just to hold this moment." She reached for his hand, held it tightly. "You don't have to burn anything," she whispered. "You already chose us." And with that, Sophie leaned her head on his shoulder, Gabriel asleep between them, and the stars above them like quiet witnesses, not to an ending, but to a beginning, a story that started in silence, darkness and pain, and ended in light, in love, in wholeness. Sometimes love doesn't arrive gently. It storms in, disguised as anger, buried under pain, tangled in silence. Sophie was never meant to be loved, not by him, not in that house, not under those conditions. But love isn't born from perfection. It's born from truth, from two broken hearts choosing again and again not to give up on each other. Dominic thought power could protect him, but in the end, it was vulnerability that saved him. And it wasn't control that gave Sophie freedom. It was forgiveness. Now they hold a new life in their arms. But the real miracle is that they learned how to live again. And you, would you be brave enough to love someone who once hurt you, if they were willing to change? If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and tell us in the comments, where are you listening from? Your like helps this channel grow and keeps these powerful stories coming. Share this video with someone special.